the lesson he never forgot. Ron Howard and the man he once misjudged. Los Angeles, 2008. In the soft amber glow of the late afternoon, Ron Howard sat silently in his living room. The golden light streamed through the window, falling across a brown leather sofa, the same one where he often sat reading scripts, reflecting on decades in film. On the TV, an old black-and-white episode of The Andy Griffith Show played. Andy Griffith's familiar face filled the screen, kind, steady, with that calm humor America had loved for generations. Ron's lips tightened. Though he had become an Oscar-winning director with a shelf full of awards, something deep inside him still lingered. A name, a shadow, a man. Andy Griffith. 1. Childhood and admiration. In 1960, little Ron Howard was only 6 years old when he landed the role of Opie Taylor, the son of Sheriff Andy Taylor, played by Andy Griffith. Back then, Andy was already a giant, a TV star whose warmth and wit captivated millions of homes across America. To Ron, Andy wasn't just a co-star, he was a second father. He was the center of the universe, Ron would later say in interviews. Andy taught him everything: how to enter a frame naturally, how to pause before a punchline, how to listen before speaking. "Don't act, Ronnie," Andy used to tell him with a knowing smile. "Just be there, that's enough." But time has a way of changing children, especially those who grow up under bright lights. 2. The quiet rift. By the 1970s, as Ron Howard transitioned from actor to filmmaker, he began to feel trapped under the shadow of his own past. Everywhere he went, people said, "Ron Howard, that red-haired boy from the Andy Griffith Show." Ron hated it. He wanted to be known for his own work, his own voice, not as someone's former boy. In a 1975 interview, when asked about Andy, Ron replied curtly, "Andy was good for his time." It was a harmless remark, or so he thought. But in print, it sounded cold, dismissive. Headlines screamed that Ron Howard looked down on Andy Griffith. The truth was different. Ron didn't despise Andy, he despised the idea of forever being defined by him. When Andy read the interview, he didn't lash out. At their next meeting, he simply smiled and said softly, "Son, someday you'll understand the difference between outgrowing someone and outgrowing what they taught you." Ron stayed silent. He was 21, ambitious, impatient, and too proud to understand. 3. When fame flipped the script. By the 1980s, Ron Howard was no longer Opie. He was the young genius behind Splash, Cocoon, Apollo 13, a rising force in Hollywood. Meanwhile, Andy Griffith had stepped back from the spotlight, spending more time in quiet corners of North Carolina. Reporters kept asking Ron, "Do you still talk to Andy?" He would shrug, offering polite but distant answers. And yet, whenever one of Ron's films premiered, Andy would send a handwritten note or a congratulatory card. When Apollo 13 earned its Oscar nominations in 1995, Andy sent a letter that read, "Proud of you, son. You flew higher than any of us ever did." Ron placed the letter in his drawer and never replied. Not because he didn't care, but because he was afraid that acknowledging it would drag him back into the label he'd fought to escape. Ron Howard, the boy Andy Griffith raised. 4. The shadow behind success. By the early 2000s, Ron Howard stood at the peak of Hollywood. A Beautiful Mind won him the Academy Award for Best Director. Critics hailed him as the storyteller of human truth. But when he came home, surrounded by golden statues and polished trophies, his eyes often wandered to a small photo on the shelf, Andy and little Ron, smiling in black and white. He took it down one night, stared at it for a long time, and whispered, "I've outgrown you." But even as he said it, he knew he hadn't. In 2006, Ron was invited to attend a ceremony honoring Andy Griffith in North Carolina. He declined politely. Yet when the live broadcast aired, he found himself unable to change the channel. Andy, older now, with silver hair and slower steps, walked onto the stage. The crowd rose in applause. He smiled humbly and said, "If I've ever done anything right in my career, it's giving that red-headed boy a chance." Ron's eyes filled with tears. For the first time, he didn't see a mentor, he saw a man who had quietly loved him like a son. 5. The final visit. 2 years later, in 2008, Ron Howard decided to visit Andy at his home in Manteo, North Carolina. Andy was frail but sharp-eyed, his voice softer but still carrying that unmistakable warmth. As Ron entered, he said with a nervous grin, "Guess I'm still that red-headed boy, huh?" Andy chuckled. "You always will be, Ronnie. And that's a good thing." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ron took a deep breath and said what he had held inside for decades. "I thought I had to move past you to be great. I thought I had to stop being your student to find my own way. But now I see, everything I did right. I learned from you." Andy's eyes softened. He placed a trembling hand on Ron's shoulder. "Then I guess I did my job." That was their last meeting. Andy Griffith passed away 4 years later, in 2012. 6. The letter never sent. When Andy died, the news broke hearts across the nation. Hollywood mourned its moral compass, its quiet teacher. Reporters flooded Ron with interview requests, but he stayed silent for weeks. Instead, he wrote a letter, one that remained private until it was displayed in a 2022 tribute exhibition. "Andy, you were the first man who taught me that truth hides behind silence, and comedy hides behind pain. When I was young, I mistook your patience for control, your wisdom for stubbornness. I thought you wanted me small so you could stay big. But now I know, you only wanted me to grow. I'm sorry it took me half a lifetime to understand that. You never asked for gratitude, but I owe you everything, not the fame, not the films, but the way I see people. You once told me, don't act, Ronnie. Just be. And that's what I've tried to do all my life, to just be. Because you showed me how." Signed simply, Ron. 7. The truth, at last. In later interviews, Ron often spoke about Andy with reverence and humility. "He was my teacher, my mentor, my North Star. I just didn't realize it until it was almost too late." Crew members from The Andy Griffith Show confirmed that Andy never once spoke ill of Ron. Andy always said Ron would be great someday, and that he'd be proud to watch him fly. When Ron produced the documentary series Pioneers of Television, he dedicated the very first episode to Andy Griffith. Without a single explanation, only a black screen with white text. "For the man who taught me everything by saying almost nothing." 8. The final scene. In 2022, during the 60th anniversary tribute for The Andy Griffith Show, Ron Howard appeared on stage unexpectedly. At 68, his hair was silver, his eyes calm and bright. When the host asked, "Ron, if Andy were here tonight, what would you say to him?" Ron looked up at the massive black and white portrait of Andy Griffith, the Sheriff of Mayberry, hand resting on Lil Opie's shoulder. He smiled and said softly, "I'd tell him, I never stopped being your boy." The audience rose in thunderous applause, many in tears. And for a brief moment, it felt as if Mayberry had come alive again, not through laughter, but through love and gratitude. 9. The legacy of two men. Today, when people mention Ron Howard, they talk about A Beautiful Mind, Apollo 13, and Rush. But in nearly every speech he gives, there's always a moment when he returns to The Andy Griffith Show, and to the man who taught him that acting isn't pretending, it's feeling. In his own way, Ron has become what Andy once was, a storyteller who teaches through kindness, patience, and truth. In a 2021 interview, Ron reflected, People think I was embarrassed by Andy. No, I was overwhelmed by him. He was too good, too honest. I just wasn't ready to understand that kind of greatness. 10. The silence that spoke. When the tribute exhibition ended and the crowd drifted away, Ron stayed behind. He walked up to a large framed photo of Andy, the familiar, smiling face of his mentor, and gently touched the corner of the glass. "You were right, Andy," he whispered. "I understand now." No one heard him, but as he stood there, the faint sound of a banjo seemed to echo through the hall. The theme song of the Andy Griffith Show, floating softly through time, like a farewell. Ron bowed his head, eyes wet, his heart light. No pride, no distance. Only a student saying thank you, decades late, but sincere. Dove Epilogue. The man who taught him to be. Years later, a young film student asked Ron Howard, "What's the greatest lesson you ever learned in Hollywood?" Ron smiled gently and said, "It wasn't from Hollywood. It was from a man in Mayberry who told me, don't act. Just be." And so, half a century later, Andy Griffith's words still echo, not only in the world of television but in the heart of the boy who once misunderstood him. Ron Howard never truly disrespected Andy Griffith. He simply didn't understand him, not yet. And when he finally did, the only thing left between them was gratitude.